how old is shamanism, and how can you sort of talk about a little bit about like what do we look for in the archaeological record to try and discern that when we don't have the ability to speak to people, and we have to figure it out indirectly from things that happened in the deep past?
Yeah. Well, that's always been a challenge. Excuse me. That's always been a challenge to archaeology to try to identify evidence of ritual and religion in the past. Certain architectural forms are interpreted as, having religious significance, particularly when they, allow large groups of people to, be around a central place. Evidence of burial is often taken as evidence of a spiritual belief, but what that, tells us about religious practice is often quite limited. Putting practical items of life, food and tools in graves is often thought to be evidence of a belief in an afterlife. What do we, find for shamanism? Well, I think I'll just sort of go back. I mean, first, we see these patterns of behavior briefly reported in the ancient historical records about, group activities that had to do with singing and dancing and drumming and the animal powers. Pretty good indication it was shamanism. When we get back into just strictly the physical record, well, evidence of rituals inside of caves is often inferred to be some kind of shamanic ritual. Paintings of human beings with mushrooms is taken to be evidence of shamanic practices. Rock art of humans flying, taken to be evidence of shamanic beliefs or abilities. Various depictions of combined human and animal body parts, theranthropes, as they're called. When we see these mix of animals and humans in depictions, we assume it's shamanism. What did we have before that? Well, to me, what we have before, we have any archaeological record is we have some notion of human evolution and continuity with our primate cousins. So basic principle of evolution is that it's conservative, that it keeps what was there before and adds something to it. So how can we find the origins of human ritual? Well, I say we have to look for the patterns of ritual in what are called the hominids, our ape ancestors, from which we diverged 6 to 8 million years ago. So what are the common patterns of communal ritualizations of chimpanzees? The chimpanzees have what is typically a every night reunification ritual. The tribe is dispersed during the day to optimize foraging, finding food. They come together at night for safety. So how do they come together? The alpha male picks a tree, goes up in the tree, starts making long distance calls, starts banging on the tree, beating on the tree, drumming on the tree, jumping up and down, screaming. And as the members of the group hear him and come towards him, then he comes down to attack them, runs at them bipedally, and they get down submissively, and he leaves them alone and lets them go up in the tree. So they have this nighttime ritual then that everybody gets together up in the tree and engages in what's called group chorusing, which basically is a way that you talk about primate singing. And they beat and drum on the trees, and it has a variety of integrative effects, adaptive effects in terms of protecting from predators, establishing intergroup boundaries, etc. So to me, what we have to assume is that that was also the beginning of hominin ritual, our own unique human ancestors. And what was added to that in the course of human evolution began with what's called the mimetic suite. We evolved the capacity about 1.5 million years ago for mimesis, enactment, drama, a kind of show and tell thing, as well as music and singing and drumming and tool making. But these all came together as a package that was a consequence of our ability to exactly imitate others. And it appears that it was the evolution of the mirror neurons that gave us this uniquely human capacity. We say things like monkey see, monkey do, but monkeys and primates do not have the mimetic enactment capacity, the ability to learn by observation. Not even chimpanzees effectively learn by observation. But we acquired that capacity over 1 million years ago, and it gave us this capacity for a whole wide range of mimetic abilities. And so to me, that's where the platform of shamanism must be seen as having begun. This is what we had beyond what the chimpanzees have in their every night, re-encounters, the ritualized re-encounters. How that evolved, I think, may have also been very deep. Some of the key aspects of shamanism would include things such as the out-of-body experience. And I've pointed out that this embodied experience is a mimetic experience. It's an experience of the expressed body. So I think once we had a mimetic capacity, then ritual and psychedelics would have enabled us to have out-of-body experiences like shamans have. So around 1.5 million years ago, something clicked. We became, a shamanic-like society and culture.
So if you go back to, so I like how you try to tie this back to our evolutionary roots with other apes. So if we diverge from chimps something like 6 million years ago, what you just said is a nightly ritual that many chimpanzee groups have is they come together, called usually by the alpha chimp in the group, and that involves various social behaviors that bond the group together, that reinforce who's in charge and what the hierarchy is, and even things like drumming on the trees, as you mentioned, which is a really interesting thing. And I've heard that before, that they like to drum on certain trees, and they have a real affinity for some of these trees, and they really go out of their way to go to these types of places to come together as they're going about their movements in their lives. And so if you have that kind of level of group ritual behavior 6 million years ago, and then somewhere after that, up when you start seeing like cave paintings and things, you mentioned the things that we often see in these cave paintings, like the people with mushrooms, the people flying, or the half animal, half human hybrids. What's the timeline there? When do some of those earliest cave paintings with those kinds of depictions start to come online, and where do we first see those on the globe?
Well, I think those kinds of rock art paintings around 50,000 years ago, I think the best examples are from Europe, but it was likely occurring in this way around the world at about the same time. Actually, I have 3 chapters in here that look first at the evolution of ritual, second, the evolution of spiritual concepts, and third, the evolution of shamanic altered states of consciousness. And all of these together sort of provide an overall model of how we got from our hominid base shared with the apes to what became the basis of a pre-modern religious system.
And are you familiar at all with the work of Lee Berger looking at Homo naledi and some of the early hominids like that?
No, I'm not. What does he have to say?
Well, I forget the exact timeline, but there's this recently discovered hominid species called Homo naledi, which they found the remains of in a cave in South Africa. But what's super fascinating, and I talked to him on episode 38 of the podcast, he's a paleoanthropologist, is this was a very small species of hominid. It lived not that long ago. I don't want to quote the number because I don't remember exactly, but it had a much smaller.
1 million years ago.
Yeah, I think that sounds right. But it had a much smaller cranium than we do. So its brain was very small. And yet, despite having the small brain and what you might assume comes with that, what they found is a bunch of remains of many individuals deep inside of a cave system. And it doesn't appear that the bones were brought there by bears or cats or predators. It doesn't appear that a flood washed the bones in there. It appears, for all intents and purposes, that these bodies were brought there. And the implication, if that's true, is that this species with a relatively small brain compared to ours, 1 million years ago, potentially or more, was ritualistically, burying the dead or placing the dead deep inside of these caves. And of course, that begs the question, how did they get into the cave? Well, they must have had fire. And I wondered if you had followed that story at all, because it sort of speaks to how old some of these ritual practices could be.
Yeah, well, I think that burial may have been a practice that emerged long before other kinds of healing rituals, for instance, because burial is a very important practice for hygiene and reducing predator presence. So, but it sounds like deep inside of a cave, well, maybe they were trying to bury it, but we need to have good evidence that this wasn't just some kind of public health measure.
I see. I see. So it's at bare minimum, you want to be mindful of what you do with the bodies of the deceased, simply to prevent yourself from spreading disease or attracting predators who might want to come take advantage of that.
Really?
And so, when do we think, based on these cave paintings and these other things, do we think it's very likely that humans were using things like psychedelic mushrooms and other forms of psychoactives coming from the plant world or the fungal world, fairly deep in human evolutionary history?
Well, I think that we should presume that our exposure to psilocybin began, 5-6 million years ago. When we left the arboreal environment and headed out onto the savanna, we were very quickly scavenging from the carcasses of bovines. Eventually, we were hunting them, following them around, trying to kill them. Mushrooms grow out of the feces of bovine, and pretty much all the equatorial zone around the world and well up into the temperate climates, you find mushrooms that are psychedelic. Animals can't ignore mushrooms, and given their nature, I think that a very early evolutionary adaptation, a food way, a medicine way, began to distinguish among, what kind of mushrooms you can eat and feel good with and feel full, what kind, your brother ate and died and you don't want to ever do again, and what kind gave you these incredible visions and all of these enhanced perceptual capacities and different social and emotional dynamics. So I think probably 5 to 6 million years ago, humans began to be affected by psilocybin, if for nothing else, incidentally, which is to say, we were eating it from time to time and figuring out, what these things were. I think we would have been motivated to eat them because of the relationship between psilocybin and the serotonergic stress mechanisms in the body. We have a stress mechanism that's sort of an endurance mechanism, putting up with bad stuff. And we have a stress mechanism that's like, we're going to change something about what's going on here. Either I'm getting the hell out of here or this problem is going to be resolved. And it's that creative response to stress that's stimulated by serotonin 5-HT2A, which is stimulated by psilocybin and the other, similar psychedelics. So I think, for millions of years, we were incidentally using these. And somewhere along the way, they became incorporated into ritual deliberately. Exactly when that happened is not clear yet. But I think eventually we'll be able to show that these kinds of selective effects upon the human genome and human evolution probably began about the same time, long before the evolution of mimesis.
I see. So do you think that, the use of psychedelics or other psychoactives, it's just a piece of this sort of group bonding mechanism that was really important for maintaining the types of social cohesion that would have been necessary for hunter-gatherer groups just to survive and compete in, throughout evolutionary history?
Yeah, well, I think that, the psychedelics certainly enhance social relations, interpersonal relations. We know that from contemporary research on the clinical effects. I think they also went way beyond that in terms of perhaps giving us our first understanding of symbols. We have this bad habit of referring to these experiences as hallucinations, but anybody who studies them is very clear that these are important sources of information. This is a visual thinking system. This is a mechanism that provides information that's often not easily available to the brain, except in dream states. And that this kind of perhaps origin of symbolism through psychedelics has to be given serious consideration. Could have been, the original symbols were these visual symbols that came about under these experiences. And then we tried to figure out, what is my brain telling me? What do these visions and this information and these things I'm seeing mean? What should I be doing with this?
And is that where, so when we go back to sort of the social functions of shamanism that you were speaking to before, a lot of it had to do with prediction and uncertainty. I know, a concept that I read in one of your papers is divination. So can you talk a little bit about divination and how this ties into sort of creative problem solving and what you're speaking to here about symbolic cognition?
Well, I mean, when the shaman wanted to get information, they did the ritual in which they entered an altered state that overlapped with the dream periods. I mean, typically these shamanic rituals were overnight. So by, drumming and dancing for 3 or 4 hours and then laying down, the shaman automatically is going to fall into a dream cycle, but a dream cycle that's going to be far more active in the sense of awareness because of all the physical activity the shaman's just done. Now, why go into the dreams? Well, dreams are a visual information system. Dreams are sort of a representational system of our emotions, our psychology, our interpersonal relations, of our innate structures. And so these kinds of information capacities get stimulated, elicited, elevated by shamanic ritual, and obviously by the psychedelics. So what we know about the psychedelics effects on the brain makes it very clear why you'd want to use them in context of divination. Basically, what you get under the psychedelic brain is a brain that has two major shifts in its global dynamics. The first global shift is the disabilitation of the top-down control network. So the prefrontal cortex that sort of sits between the frontal brain and the mammalian brain is disrupted, taken offline. And then the default mode network, which sort of connects to the prefrontal cortex and to all these other areas of the brain, particularly personal memory and our learning and things like that, this gets taken offline too. And these are the two parts of the brain that basically run the show for the most part. The frontal cortex when we're in control, and the default mode network when we're like not paying too much attention and sort of daydreaming. And what the altered states induced by psychedelics do is take these two parts of the brain offline, partially through habituation of the serotonergic mechanisms. The second phase emerges, which is a bottom-up dynamic in which the ascending serotonergic networks that come out of what we can call, the reptilian brain, these ancient parts of our behavioral brain, and project up into the mammalian brain and the frontal cortex. These are getting activated, and they're getting activated in ways that are manifested in an ascending theta wave discharge. Theta wave cycles that pump from the bottom of the brain to the top and bring up with it, liberate all of this information that's our unconscious brain that's normally not allowed access to consciousness. And then under these conditions, what's happening among all these normally repressed aspects of the brain is we're getting an enhanced interconnectivity between these different parts of the brain. And so instead of just the frontal brain telling you what to look for, all these aspects of the brain that are normally unconscious are, one, given ascendance, and two, being integrated with one another. And so this integration is like a synesthesia. We're putting different sensory cognitive capacities together. And I think this explains, for instance, why under the effects of psychedelics, seeing aliens and entities is so prevalent, because among our innate intelligences, our intelligence for social others, for inferring their thoughts, called mind reading, for assuming their roles, called socialization, including these innate capacities for understanding animals. And what we see in shamanism is all of these social modules and the animal module are getting integrated together to produce these animal powers. In the modern world, the animal part gets dropped off, but we still have these highly intelligent beings that have some important messages for us. They're trying to tell us what to do. I think that reflects the liberation of our ancient brain systems.
Oh, I see. So what you're saying is basically that the imagery people see today that involves things like entities or aliens or whatever, the imagery that people would have very potently seen historically as hunter-gatherers, things to do with, animals and stuff, it has to do with their brain trying to understand how all of these players in their ecology are actually working. What are the animals actually doing out in the world, and what can I understand about them? What are the people in my group doing? And how can I understand how to interact with them? And so this involves not only, sensing these things through, direct perception, but using things like mimesis and imagination to put yourself in someone's shoes or try to imagine which way the buffalo are going to go or what have you.
Yeah, certainly the psychedelics enhance this capacity to elevate and integrate these unconscious modules. And I think the integration part is what's so important here, because what we see in the context of altered states of consciousness, of shamanism, is this integration of capacities that are normally thought to function relatively independently. And so these ancient spiritual experiences really are a sense, an elevation and expansion of our innate capacities to perceive social others and further thoughts. And we can extend that to nature. So as you were saying, to understand how all these things put together to provide explanations. And this leads to mythology, the creation of accounts about why these things are connected. Even if the accounts aren't true, they're giving plausible meaning to people's life.
I see. So even if these narratives that emerge, these mythologies aren't literal accounts of history, they reflect the kind of symbolic cognition that is necessarily involved in integrating all of these different information streams together about how the world around you is actually working, the social world and the natural and the physical world.
Right. I think it's important to point out. This is not just how they're working, but how they're interrelated that the altered states and shamanism give.